Stuart Nash has resigned as police minister after criticising a judge's decision and phoning the police commissioner to discuss whether it would be appealed. Political commentator Peter Dunne joins us now to discuss this. Good morning, Peter. Thank you for your time this morning. Look, it was a silly lack of judgment. He couldn't continue as Minister of Police. Of course, the only question is whether he should have resigned altogether. What are your thoughts?
Well, I think he should have resigned altogether for this simple reason. The Cabinet Manual makes it clear that you don't interfere in court decisions and the police have constabulary independence. He breached both those counts. He wasn't Minister of Police at the time. He was holding other portfolios. And the Cabinet Manual doesn't discriminate. It says all ministers are bound by its provisions, etc. So I just don't think it's good enough to say, well, you stand down as Minister of Police, because the breach was as a minister and not as a specific portfolio minister, and therefore he should go altogether.
Does this sort of reflect well on Prime Minister Hipkins in the sense that he's shown to take a strong hand to this?
Well, it's interesting. I think the swiftness with which he moved gives him credit for being decisive and clear and bold and setting standards and all of that sort of thing. But the timidity of the judgment, really, and saying just give up the police portfolio and carry on with other portfolios, I think detracts from that. It looks like a little bit on the one hand, on the other. I think a cleaner break would have been, as I said, to have dismissed them altogether and allowed the government to move on. But that might have been a bit too politically embarrassing.
Yes. All right, well, on to the teachers' strike now, and I guess that was probably inevitable after last year's big settlement for the firefighters. So, are you in support of this teachers' strike? And, I mean, why wouldn't they push their luck?
Well, I can understand why the teachers will be going on strike. I can understand the pressures, et cetera, that they're under at the moment. But I think that they've been emboldened, if you like, by the way the government came to the party in the end to help settle the firefighters' dispute. And I noticed yesterday even the Minister of Education was saying teachers aren't paid enough. So if I was one of the teachers' leaders, I'd be saying to myself at the moment, we just hang in there now and we push and we push and we push, and the government, as it has done previously, will cave in the end. So I think that's really what's behind it. I think they've got the public on side, as the firefighters did, and it's going to be very difficult for the government to resist the demands that they're making.
How do you think that this is going to play out for the government and Chris Hipkins?
Well, I think two things, really. Firstly, it depends what level of disruption there is across the country today. If parents feel that this is a step too far, or if they're prepared to be, as they seem to be so far, supportive of what the teachers are doing, that will give them a bit of fresh air. But the second thing will be what the government's response is. If the government comes back with a better offer more quickly, then this will be settled, obviously, more quickly. But if the government tries to dig in, then this is going to go on for a little while. And it's the last thing a Labor government wants in an election year, is teachers marching in the streets. So I think inevitably the cards are going to fall the teachers' way. It's just a matter of when.
Might have been a perfect time for a strike for them. Speaking of political polls, though, I mean, we have seen Labor up again, Chris Luxon's support down. Do you think that this will be as good as it gets for Labor, or do you think they are yet to peak?
Well, that's the question. You can take two views on this. One is the yet to peak argument. The other one is as good as it gets. I just note that with the economy in recession, with a tough winter ahead, with things like the health reform still not producing goods, with now the Nash affair, teachers dispute, et cetera, it's not looking good for the government long term. But the problem that the National Party has is presented with all these opportunities. It's failed to capitalise on any of them. It should be well ahead in the polls by now. The fact that it's sort of level pegging with Labor doesn't really bode well for it. So it's got to get its act together if it's going to make an impact this year. Otherwise, Labor, despite all the problems, might just get there by default. I
guess it's the old story of the squeaky wheel gets the oil. I mean, National should be plugging away and coming out and making a stronger stance on these things and actually being heard, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the National Party, I think, has got policies that it's about to unveil. It seems to be more disciplined than it was a couple of years ago. But that's just not getting through to the public because they don't seem to be taking the fight to Labor. They're sort of doing, good, solid stuff, but none of it's dramatic. None of it's providing a reason to doubting voters as to why they should vote for National. And by default, as I say, Labor is the beneficiary.
Yeah, that's right. And, of course, let's talk about the Greens. They're probably feeling a little bit resentful right now. I mean, Chris Hipkins has sort of shafted them a little bit this week, but the problem is they've got nowhere else to go, have they?
No, that's their real problem. I think they have been shafted. I think Hipkins knows they've got nowhere else to go, so he can take some risks. But the Greens are making threats about don't take our support for granted after the election if you need us. I think that's hollow talk because, as you say, they've got nowhere else to go. But the question it does raise, though, is to get them really back in the tent, what is Hipkins going to give them? Which means how many of the policies that were on the bonfire that were Greens' favourites are going to get resurrected after the election if Labor and the Greens are in a position to form a government? I think people need to be asking that question. And again, it's something the National Party should be pushing. You know, is the bonfire going to burn permanently, or is it just a temporary gimmick to get us through the election period and you'll give all this stuff back to the Greens after that? At the moment, the National's just sitting quiet on this.
I mean, history would tell us that in an election year, it's a number of promises are made and then they go back on them, once they win the election.
Yeah, and I think this is where Hipkins, I think, has a problem. He's been very decisive and very clear about what he's putting to one side. I think if his plan is just to kick them for touch until the election and then bring them all back, he's going to pay a terrible price eventually when people realise they've been duped. I suspect his plan is somewhere between the two extremes, but obviously, to get the Greens back in the tent, he's going to have to offer them some sort of concessions. And the question is just simply what those will be.
I think it's time for National to step up and start making some noise. Political commentator Peter Dunne, we thank you very much for your time this morning and your insight.